I know I'm gonna get called a Sony pony for this video, but you know what? I do not give a flying fuck in this case. I feel like Microsoft should not have been allowed to get as far as they have with their acquisition of Activision-Blizzard. Judge Jacqueline Scott Corley has decided to rule in favor of Microsoft. The judge had this to say on the matter. Microsoft's acquisition of Activision has been described as the largest in tech history. It deserves scrutiny. That scrutiny has paid off. Microsoft has committed in writing, in public, and in court to keep Call of Duty on PlayStation for 10 years on parity with Xbox. It made an agreement with Nintendo to bring Call of Duty to Switch, and it entered several agreements to, for the first time, bring Activision's content to several cloud gaming services. This court's responsibility in this case is narrow. It is to decide if, notwithstanding these current circumstances, the merger should be halted, perhaps even terminated, pending resolution of FTC administrative action. For the reason explained, the court finds the FTC has not shown a likelihood it will prevail on its claim this particular vertical merger in this specific industry may substantially lessen competition. To the contrary, the record evidence points to more consumer access to Call of Duty and other Activision content. The motion for a preliminary injunction is therefore denied. It should be noted Microsoft still faces an ongoing antitrust lawsuit from the FTC. But with this decision made by Judge Corley, the merger of Activision Blizzard into Microsoft could still go through, and that's ultimately a horrible thing for gamers, not just PlayStation ones. You all know my stance on Call of Duty. I think it's fucking shit, and I wish the series would fucking die. Also, I do not give much of a fuck about any given Activision game. There's a reason I mostly call them Crap Division. Beyond Crash and Spyro, I don't actually give a damn about any of their properties. I stopped caring about Warcraft when they changed from a real-time strategy title into an MMORPG, because I just don't care for MMOs. I find their loops slow and boring for the most part, and I don't like the idea of paying a monthly cost on top of a game I've already bought. So let's get into why this is bad for gamers. If you look at the quote, Judge Corley is not wrong when they say this is probably the biggest tech acquisition in history, because it technically is. This also deserves scrutiny because Microsoft has already admitted they've lost the console wars, so their acquisition of Activision is just a petty decision on their part to actually fuck over consumers. While Microsoft has said they will keep it on parity for 10 years, that does not indicate that they'll do so after those 10 years are up. They could then make one of the biggest gaming franchises completely exclusive at that point, and that says nothing of what they'll do to Crash and Spyro or even their other properties. Warcraft and StarCraft matter very little, as those are PC-based titles. Clearly, the plan for Microsoft is to make a monopoly on gaming and force Nintendo and Sony out long term. This is a bad thing for the industry, because ultimately all Activision properties will end up being Microsoft exclusive despite what the tech giant says. This is their MO, and it always has been: choke out smaller companies and force them out of the industry if they're competition, whilst acquiring others that will help them long term. Also, let's face it, gamers aren't going to buy whatever intellectual property Sony comes up with that replaces Call of Duty long term, because COD gamers only care about fucking COD. They typically do not buy other games. So what choice does that leave Sony? Because we know Call of Duty just isn't going to sell all that well on Nintendo platforms, because Nintendo fanboys and girls generally don't go for the mega gritty titles like that. There's nothing wrong with the bright and colorful worlds Nintendo creates. Far from it. It's just COD is not part of their demographic. Ultimately, it won't affect Nintendo too much, since their core player base like platformers and RPGs for the most part. This is mostly going to affect Sony. Sony might try to create a new IP that is similar to COD, but that won't work, as I stated previously. Also, if Sony tries an FPS title that's different from COD, they aren't bringing in the COD players. But that isn't what ultimately concerns me, which is what I'm going to discuss next. What does concern me is what Microsoft will do with Crash Bandicoot and Spyro the Dragon. Even though they've stated they do not intend to orphan player bases that are established on other hardware, I don't buy it. Not for a second. Of the IPs in Activision-Blizzard stables, Crash and Spyro are two of the biggest and their legacy franchises that cut their teeth on PlayStation. That's also where the majority of their player base is. I'd not be surprised if Crash and Spyro wind up being Microsoft exclusive IPs long term, which pisses me off. Sure, I have a PC that can run them more than likely, but that's beside the point. My preferred platform is PlayStation, and this decision affects PlayStation gamers most. If Xbox and PC get some additional content that PlayStation gamers won't get, then that's fine. But if the games are locked out of PlayStation platforms, that is very anti-consumer. While exclusive games do matter, these exclusives should come from within, not from the acquisition of outside studios. Which, if this acquisition happens, Sony will need to respond with something big. I took a look at some of the studios Sony should look to acquire, so check that video out when you're done with this one. But that's beside the point. This acquisition doesn't feel organic. It's not like Microsoft and Activision had some long-standing partnership that resulted in iconic games. This is just one conglomerate buying out another one to fuck over a third mega corporation. Now, I'm in no way campaigning for Sony to acquire Square Enix, but that acquisition would at least make some sense given the two companies have had a close working relationship and have mostly been in that position since the PlayStation 1 days. I imagine had Sony acquired Square before Microsoft acquired Activision, that the FTC would have probably met that merger with just as much scrutiny, possibly more. There's still a chance the Microsoft deal gets nixed, but I highly doubt that at this point in time. This acquisition has me concerned for the state of the gaming industry as a whole, as it has morphed from competition that favored the consumer into basically corporate warfare. One could say this is just an evolution of the console wars, and to a degree, it is. Only it went from some idiotic consumers throwing hateful words at each other, to not only that, but corporations getting into dick measuring contests over who has the biggest and shiniest studios. I fucking hate it. The reason I hate it so much is because having fewer larger publishers available like Activision-Blizzard really fucks over smaller studios even if it doesn't seem obvious. There's a knockdown effect. Activision, and by extent other large publishers being acquired by one of the big three means previously existing business deals will probably get nixed as people leave via layoffs and other things. It also means small studios have less means to have their games distributed to a wider audience. Let's look at NIS America just for a second. At present, they have a really close relationship with my favorite developer, Nihon Falcom. Let's say Microsoft acquires them next. That's a bad thing for Falcom, as their core audience is not on Xbox. It's primarily on PC and on PlayStation, with Nintendo as the third player. This would likely mean Falcom would have to look for a different publishing partner in the West if they want to reach as broad an audience as possible. These types of mergers mean that smaller companies ultimately have less choices, which is bad for them, and if their core audience is rather niche, that's bad for the consumer as well, as it means games that aren't as mainstream will likely get seen by fewer and fewer eyes, either because the smaller companies have to look for smaller publishers who may not have the marketing budget to get their titles seen by new audiences, or because companies will become more and more risk adverse, as their profit margins will become tighter and tighter if they aren't partnered up with one of the big three, which brings me on to a different point entirely. There was a time when there were a lot more options for the consumer when it came to consoles. This had its own downsides, as it meant more console proliferation on the market, which in some ways watered down the competition. This is partially what led to the video game crash of 1983 to 1985. There were too many machines on the market and not enough good games coming out to match. Loss of publishing control was also a contributing factor. However, in modern gaming, another large console manufacturer could help fix things to some degree, but with a large publishing and development house likely to shift to making Microsoft exclusive games next decade, it becomes a less viable option. Why does it become less of a viable option though? Because companies will again be more risk adverse. With two of the big three acting like hungry wolves gobbling up publishers, it makes the pool of companies a fledgling console maker could partner up with that much smaller. So it's incredibly similar to Point 4, just on a grander scale. which is ultimately a bad thing for the industry. However, I will cover one reason why this merger could be potentially good for the industry. The only reason I can think of that might be a positive for the gaming industry is the fact it might mean developers that are part of both PlayStation Studios and companies that fall under part of Nintendo's umbrella might take this as a reason to light a fire under their respective asses and produce more great games. In which case, those who own those consoles do benefit as they'll have more great exclusives. But there is one caveat. Game development is taking longer than it ever has, and it's becoming more costly. If companies wish to saturate their consoles with great games, that introduces crunch culture similar to what we had in the 90s and 2000s, which is a bad thing as that got insanely toxic at times. So those were just some of the reasons this decision has me a little bit concerned about the state of the gaming industry. But what do you think? Let me know in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe. 2 of my previous videos will be popping up now. One is a video YouTube thinks you'll enjoy, the other is my list of studios Sony should look at acquiring. Until next time, keep blazing that trail.